Morgoth went ever halt of 1 foot after that day, and the pain of his wounds could not be healed, and in his face was the scar that Thorondor made. Hey everyone, Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today we are taking a look at the story of the Silmarillion from Morgoth's perspective, how he viewed the War of the Jewels, as well as the context before it, and how victory must have seemed, to him at least, inevitable. It's a really interesting thing to see the story from this perspective, because even though we know how the story plays out, a couple things are definitely revealed from seeing it through his eyes, so please stay tuned for that. My friends, thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. Melkor was, from the beginning, the greatest of the Ainur, as it was told to him by Eru Ilúvatar. He knew that his fundamental strength, his discord in the creation of Ea, all of this changed things. Perhaps in the beginning, and throughout Melkor's time in Arda, he did not fully understand what true life, the flame imperishable, was, for he could never find it in the void. But honestly, even though he couldn't, it doesn't really seem to bother the Dark Lord all that much. So long as Melkor could create subjects in his own image to rule over during the course of his time in Ea, he really didn't care if they had free will or not, or so it seems by his deeds at least. This is how he was in the beginning, uncaring of the love and the compassion that Eru put into the foundation of the world itself. He had his own vision in mind. Now, if we take Melkor's perspective upon entering Arda into account after the music of the Ainur, the Ainulindale, we see that he knew he was the most powerful thing in Arda, because Eru wasn't there in the same way he was, if not the second most powerful thing in the universe right behind Eru. Melkor also could not understand much of what his brother Manwë knew. Mercy, kindness, compassion, the will of Ilúvatar. He knew these things far less than others amongst the Valar, if at all. But Melkor was also arrogant enough to think that such things didn't really matter. To him, the world was made for the strongest to thrive and conquer, a domain to rule if he could. And Melkor would, essentially throughout his entire existence, attempt to fill this role. Of course, we know that the Valar were meant to shepherd the world in a way that, with the Maiar, their servants, they could make it suitable and ready for the children of Ilúvatar, and allow them, the favorite of Eru's creations, to live out their lives in Middle-earth, each kindred with a fate of their own. Right, a purpose beyond their understanding as Valar, but they would still attend to it. But Melkor either knew little or cared little for this entire plan. Without Eru in the form that he, Manwë, Varda, and the other Valar had upon the world of Middle-earth, or Arda, Melkor felt that he had the right, through power, to overwhelm anything that stood in his way and make the world his thraldom. And so, even at the beginning, in the years of the Lamps during the Valiant years, Melkor, of course, fought against the Valar, and disrupted many of their plans and intentions as he attempted to take the world over. He marred Arda. He would eventually be incarcerated after the war for sake of the Elves during 1090 to 1099 of the Years of the Trees. I think Melkor learned actually a lot in these early excursions, successes, and failures. The Valar were susceptible to quick ambush-like attacks, such as Melkor's destruction of the Lamps, but he alone was not enough to overcome the unity of the Valar. He really had to retreat from them and be tactical, because, as he found out with being captured, they could overwhelm him. And though they all viewed Melkor slightly differently, he also would come to find that there could be nothing he could do to truly separate them and break them apart. They were pretty unified, all things considered. But as soon as the ages of Melkor's imprisonment were at an end, the Elves certainly caught his eye. Melkor was restricted to stay in Valinor during the late Years of the Trees, but for the Dark Lord, I actually think that is exactly where he wanted to be. He might not be able to divide the Valar and their people, the Maiar, at least not any more than he already had with the corruption of Mairon into Sauron or the Valaraukar into the Balrogs. But he could divide the children of Ilúvatar, give them pain, make the Valar feel pain through watching them. First here with the Elves and later with men, and this would obviously upset the Valar and their plans, and Eru, as well as progress his own plans to have a kingdom of his own in Middle-earth. Now, pausing here for but a moment, I believe one of the lessons Melkor learned was that he would never really be able to overcome the combined might of the Valar. So, other than Eru himself, there was another force that could defeat him. Now, I'm sure this was a tough pill for the Dark Lord to swallow, knowing that the whole of Arda could never truly be his, because he had been defeated earlier and, even arguably, when he was a stronger primordial force than he was in later Elder days. So the goal became to harass the plans of the Valar, cast down what they held dear, and take the divine and mar it irreversibly. But not so directly that the Valar would simply hunt him down and end him more permanently, or cast him from the world. Obviously, though, well, we'll come back to this point. He had to find some sort of middle ground to harass them and try to get what he wanted, but he knew he could never take over Valinor and defeat them utterly. Or perhaps he was arrogant enough to think that he could beat them if given enough time, but, spoiler warning, he couldn't. To that end, however, Melkor would then set his eyes on the star of the Noldor. Likely the Vanyar elves were just too pure and too close to the Valar physically and spiritually to corrupt them. The Teleri, well, many of them had stayed in Middle-earth proper. No, the Noldor were powerful, yet perhaps arrogant enough, at least many of them, chaotic enough, ambitious enough, to wield them in his schemes. Especially a few key players among them, particularly their greatest craftsman, Feanor. Melkor knew how to manipulate people, and even if Feanor never trusted him so fully as to directly serve him, it honestly would be quite easy for the Dark Lord to shape the elf's wrath, arrogance, and fury inwards and towards the Valar. That there might be a schism, and Melkor could desecrate the things that they held most dear, and make an escape to Middle-earth, while sundering elven relations as well. We definitely see this chaotic evil that Melkor is in all of this, but while he may be a bit short-sighted in some ways, he's certainly not stupid. Using Feanor's hatred of Melkor against the elf, but also his jealousy of his brothers, distrust of the Valar, and desire to be a lord of his own land in his own right, Melkor owned Feanor in so many ways, and indeed, Feanor's wrath would end up in the Oath and the first kinslaying. Melkor could not have known that there would be so much of a bonus in this plan, but it really helped out Melkor's plans. Now, as for his short-sightedness, Melkor recruited the help of Ungoliant to destroy the two trees of Valinor, of course, but it seems like, in a similar way to underestimating the Valar, he did the same with her. After slaying Feanor's father Finwë, stealing the Silmarils, destroying the two trees, and escaping the grasp of Arome and Tolkas, Melkor must have felt like he was already on top of the world, but for his conflict with Ungoliant. This in many ways was bigger than him, though. It is a common theme that Tolkien, through the weaving of the tale of Eru's world in Ea, puts into stories of Middle-earth. Evil does not trust evil, and though tyrants shall believe all others will follow them and their power, it usually ends in treachery and distrust. Melkor and Ungoliant, Saruman and Sauron, and so forth. But luckily for Melkor, in this case, which might have cut his whole story short, and he does have a lot of this throughout the tale, he was just insanely lucky. And his Balrogs answered his call and freed him from Ungoliant's grasp, and Ungoliant fled and never troubled him again. Honestly, again, Melkor is quite lucky throughout much of the Silmarillion, and this is definitely one of those cases. Thus, returning to his armory of Angband that Sauron had kept watch over since the war for sake of the Elves, he took his place on the throne, suffering the burns of the Silmarils on his hand but not on his head, using the Iron Crown to hold them in place. At this point, Melkor, now Morgoth, must have been at his happiest, if you can call it that, moment, simply because he got everything he had ever wanted since leaving captivity, disrupting the children of Eru, destroying the trees, collecting the Silmarils, assassinating one of the kings of all of the elves, humiliating and defacing the Valar and their precious land, making it back to his fortress, to his loyal thralls and slaves. He really got most everything he wanted. Now, he needed to carve out his kingdom. And while Melian the Maya particularly might pose an issue in Beleriand, I don't believe he was too incredibly worried about the Sindar and Green Elves, but again, he underestimated them. What's more, elves would arrive following Feanor, which likely gave him a little bit of pause, but could not have been entirely unexpected. Surely, however, he must have enjoyed the fact that the Noldor were fractured, and that the following of Feanor was not in fact all of the Noldor. They performed well during the Dagor Nuin Gileath, the Battle Under Stars, But again, it actually worked for Morgoth better than if it had been a closer match, because Feanor pushed ahead, was overconfident because of how well they did, and got himself killed. I'm sure Angband was filled with Morgoth's laughter and unexpected delight. Following this, of course, Morgoth tried to see if he could get an even better deal and capture Feanor's eldest son, the new High King, Mythros, through sending messengers to speak with him, all while it was a ruse for an ambush. Even though the elves figured this was the case, Morgoth was successful and better at this treachery. He had a bigger force, so Mythros was captured and pinned to Thangorodrim. Morgoth was really winning at pretty much everything he was doing at this point, but he was about to take a loss, and a bit of a substantial one at that, with the arrival of Fingolfin's army, the waxing of the moon and sun and so forth. The newly arrived Noldor pinned Morgoth and Angband with a siege, freed Mythros, and unified under Fingolfin. They actually forgave each other, at least somewhat, enough to unify. This is not something Morgoth could really comprehend or understand, one of those good virtues that was outside of his realm of knowledge, and this will come back later in the story as well. This, plus the coming of the second children of Iluvatar, and having to pay some heed to the dwarves, the adopted children as well, Morgoth could not have felt great about all of that. However, it would give him a chance to work and experiment, all while not having to really worry about the elves invading Angband. And he could create new weapons of devastating magnitude, the dragons. Glaurung, the father of dragons, would at one point run out and harass the elves, much to Morgoth's dismay, when he was not yet ready. But still, over a few centuries, which, for one of the Ainur is not much, Morgoth had so much time to prepare, while the elves prepared less and harried him hardly at all. Honestly, giving Morgoth more time to prepare for what was to come was the worst thing the Free Peoples could have done, but they didn't really have a choice because they did not have the strength to invade Angband itself. And so came the Battle of Sudden Flame in 455 of the First Age, which, much to Morgoth's delight, slew many of the Free Peoples, broke the siege, and allowed him access to the north, at least somewhat. And again, even though the Maiar carrying the sun and moon had annoyed him, he sent up some clouds and spirits to fix that. It was nothing like if the Valar themselves were coming to defeat him. He had not provoked them enough, and so he was still just battling the children of Eru. He could work with that, and did. Fingolfin would embarrass Morgoth a bit in this moment, challenging him and putting the Dark Lord in a lose-lose situation. Either the Dark Lord would risk his own pain at the hands of the elf, or be disrespected in front of his slaves, and be seen as a coward for not fighting the elf. So he did come forward to duel the king of the elves. While he won, Morgoth did suffer permanent scars, 7 of them in fact, and would be crippled evermore, and Thorondor the Eagle would also tear his face. From then on, Morgoth would never, ever want to go forth from his fortress, knowing that he was vulnerable. He tried to make himself the god of the world, but Fingolfin made that god bleed. So he was far more careful at this point, being probably weaker, at least in some ways, than he had been in the past. We have some lore that Morgoth put much of his energy, that which made him so powerful in years prior, he put a lot of that forth into his slaves and thralls, into his creations. So he was more vulnerable now, and Fingolfin proved that. But once more, this hardly mattered in the grand scheme of things. The elves had suffered a great loss, and Beleriand was now more open to Morgoth's forces. The theft of one of his Silmarils, however, now that was unexpected, particularly from a man and elf of the Sindar, which came soon after this battle. Once more, Morgoth suffered some humiliation from Beren and Luthien, but that is what his arrogance and even his evil lust for Luthien would get him. He never learned his lesson, though, even if his lieutenant Sauron was defeated and driven back. The Free Peoples would unite against him once more, and many hidden elven kingdoms would send forth their people to attempt to re-establish the siege on Angband. But Morgoth was more prepared for this, even taking the aid of treacherous Easterlings. Thus the Battle of Unnumbered Tears occurred in 472, and this was an unmitigated disaster for the Free Peoples and victory for Morgoth, and it directly led to a number of events that were all good for Morgoth. It opened up even more of Beleriand for his forces. He was able to curse Hurin and his family for his own amusement and to soothe his pride that Hurin had disgraced. The sons of Feanor were scattered and focused on recovering the reclaimed Silmaril instead of fighting him, turning their eyes on Doriath. Another High King of the Noldor was dead, and Morgoth could focus mostly on finding and destroying Nargothrond, Gondolin, and somehow trying to get into Doriath, despite Melion's power. If he could find a way to do all of this, he would more or less have complete victory. But here is where, again, he underestimated the Free Peoples, did not understand the will of Eru and the mandate of the Valar to make the world hospitable for the children of Iluvatar, and how bad true unity amongst his enemies could be for him. Sure, Turin would, after the battle, lead to the destruction of Nargothrond some years later, but also to the death of Glaurung. Yes, Hurin's actions would eventually lead to the death of Thingol and infighting of elves and dwarves, and eventually even the kinslaying in Doriath. And indeed, the treachery of an elf in Gondolin would also lead to the discovery and destruction of it and its High King Turgon. All of this would lead to the third kinslaying at the Havens of the Falas. Morgoth would lose a few of his soldiers in all of this, such as his most powerful Balrog, Gothmog, but even so he had victory after victory. Few, if any, could stand against him. He had won so much total victory, and even things like the kinslayings that he had not particularly planned for only worked in his favor. He sowed enough disunity even amongst the alliances of his enemies. And the smaller battles that had occurred through all of this and scattered throughout all of this history were either in his favor or inconsequential in the end. Morgoth was doing well. Too well, in fact. Indeed, he had sown a lot of disunity between the Free Peoples, his enemies, but I mentioned that true unity he should have been afraid of before. Let's get back to that. Remember how he must have seen that he could not too directly upset the Valar or things would go poorly for him. Well, having total victory ended up doing that, and while the Valar had not intervened much, due to how the Noldor had broken with them, there was one more thing, and we mentioned this before, a rather large part of humanity that Morgoth did not understand either, and it was a fatal flaw for him. He could not comprehend forgiveness and grace. The unity of elves and men in Eärendil and Elwing, people he probably didn't even know existed at all, led to his downfall, for they went west, and they pled with the Valar, and this showed the Valar that they did in fact need to intervene. They wouldn't have gone there if Morgoth hadn't pushed them to that end, and the War of Wrath wouldn't have happened, but indeed, with Morgoth's total victory, there was no other choice. So, when the War of Wrath began in 545 of the First Age, and the people of the Valar, mostly Elves, Noldor, Vanyar, Maiar, and perhaps, and likely, at least a few of the Valar like Tulkas, arrived on the shores of Beleriand, all unified and allied amongst themselves, Morgoth must have been quite scared, but still too arrogant to see his own demise at hand. He fought for decades to maintain his controlled and conquered empire, but to little avail. He surely surmised that something like Enkelagon, for instance, would be so devastating that it would win him some battles at least, and push back the tide, perhaps even against the Valar themselves, but no. Even the Valar and their forces through Eärendil and the Eagles had an answer for something like Enkelagon. Of all of the battles or wars from the Silmarillion, especially the major ones, we have the least amount of direct information on the War of Wrath, and it is likely because of its scale and lack of named characters involved, amongst other reasons. But also, it likely mirrored the wars of the Old Valiant years, like the Battle of the Powers or War for Sake of the Elves. It was so grand and fantastical, terrifying and great in scale that it would be hard to describe. But it all led to a very weakened Morgoth retreating into the depths of Angband, being cut down, begging for mercy, but having none of it, eventually being bound once more and cast out of Arda entirely at this point, never to return until the end of time. Everyone knew his tricks and his evil, and while he would plot to at least scar the world beyond recognition at the end of time in the Dagor Daggerath, if he had not already done so in the overall corrupting and marring of Arda, he at least lost his chance at victory. The victory he'd always wanted, to rule all of Arda. He would watch from beyond as his lackey Sauron attempted to do a very similar thing, and nearly succeeded in doing what Morgoth could not, ruling or destroying the world. But surely there was this hatred and jealousy there, particularly after Sauron had failed him during the Silmarillion, but Morgoth could do nothing. Though he had almost had complete victory, it was that same amount of success, arrogance, total destruction of his enemies that ultimately wrought his end. Morgoth would probably never understand the motives behind his enemies, how seeing such destruction amongst the free peoples inspired kindness, unity, forgiveness, compassion, love from the Valar, Maiar, Elves, and so forth. All of these things Morgoth saw as weaknesses, yet they overthrew him all the same. Bitterness would be his reward, well, bitterness and failure, until the end of Ea, either his death or beyond. And so, my friends, with the downfall of this great evil and the great joy of the free peoples at hand, we come to the end of our tale on the Silmarillion from Morgoth's perspective. From this tale we see that not only are kindness, love, unity, and forgiveness not weaknesses, remembering to commit ourselves to such things in our everyday and ordinary deeds will also be the only way we can defeat the darkness. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. Leave a like, comment your thoughts, my friends, and if you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weather United Cutlery Lord of the Rings swords, statues, other replicas from Castle Kon, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch. Join our memberships and Patreon for access to our Discord server and our monthly podcast. We just had an episode come out a couple days ago. Thanks to our Valor Tier patrons and YouTube members, Todes Morgen, Joby Weasel, Ed Patterson, ComicNut64, Zoomi, and Peter Sheppard. My friends, thank you all. You guys are the best. And thank you for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.